I'm Yascha, so I'm going to speak about the sort of question of what I take to be the question of this conference, which is how do we actually manage to hold societies together at a very perilous moment in which we see large changes in many parts of the world and a really new transformation of politics in big parts of the developed world as well. How do we address people's economic anxieties, but also build a kind of sense of us which is actually capable of holding these societies together? And I'm very conscious that I'm saying this 2 weeks after an election which may not seem particularly important. It's an election in a relatively small country, a country in which a government was re-elected for the 3rd time. This doesn't seem like an especially important event, but I think it is. So we had these elections 2 weeks ago in Hungary, in which Viktor Orban was re-elected for the 3rd time. He won a constitutional majority. There's over 2/3 of the parliament, is able to now change the Hungarian constitution. And I just want to start my talk by pointing out that this disproves how political scientists have seen the world for 30 years or more. So when I grew up, I knew that there were many countries in the world, and we have people from some of those countries here today, where democracy is quite fragile. If you don't have a long democratic tradition, if your country is not very affluent, we know that it's a struggle to sustain democracy, and an important one. We also knew that there were always autocratic countries which might remain stable, that not every dictatorship was bound to transition to democracy in time. That there was one core optimistic part of our worldview. And that was that there was a certain set of countries, a lot of them in North America and Western Europe, but some of them in Asia, a few of them in Latin America, Australia, and so on, in which democracy was safe. In the words of a famous paper in the 1990s by Adam Przeworski and Fernando Limongi, it was countries which had had 2 changeovers of government for free and fair elections and had reached a GDP per capita of about $14,000 in today's terms. When you counted up every country and every year in which a democracy like that was stable, you had thousands of observations, and you didn't have a single example of one that collapsed. The richest democracy that collapsed, which was below $14,000 GDP per capita, was Argentina in the late 1970s. Well, the election in Hungary disproves that theory, because Hungary has had more than 2 changes of government for free and fair elections in the last 25 years. It has a GDP per capita at this point that is above $14,000, but it's no longer a democracy. Since taking power, Prime Minister Viktor Orban has taken control of the state media and turned them into a propaganda outlet, forced the sale of most private media institutions into the hands of his allies, stacked the Supreme Court and other Hungarian courts of his political followers, taken over the Electoral Commission, rewritten electoral laws, shut down NGOs, threatened Central European University with closure. And when you take all of that together, most outside observers say that the election was somewhat free, but barely fair. And at this point, it looks unlikely that Viktor Orban is going to leave office of his own accord. So a fundamental part of the optimistic worldview we had about the world, that there are certain countries in the world in which we could be sure of its democratic future, need to be jettisoned. And the truly worrying thing is that there's lots of countries, not just in Central Europe, but in Western Europe and North America, that see the rise of similar kinds of political movements. So what I want to do today is 3 things. I want to describe briefly the breadth of this phenomenon and the seriousness of the problem we face. I want to say a little bit about the causes of this development. And finally, I just want to say a little bit about the kind of narrative of us that we need to have, and the kind of economic policies that we need to have in order to start to deal with that. So why is it that political scientists used to think that our democracies were safe? Well, in one phrase in the literature, they thought that democracy had become the only game in town. And that was supposed to mean that most citizens were deeply committed to their democracies, that they abhorred authoritarian alternatives to democracies, and perhaps most importantly, that most of the major politicians and political parties in the system that actually had power accepted the basic rules and norms of a political system. Well, as I show in my book, The People versus Democracy, that is no longer true. Look at the United States. Among older Americans, born in the 1930s and 1940s, over 2/3 say it's absolutely essential to live in a democracy. Among young Americans born since 1980, less than 1/3 do. Over time, all age groups have also become more open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy. 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans said that army rule was a good system of government. Now 1 in 6 do. Those figures are very similar to what you would have seen in Latin American countries in the 1980s and 1990s, often before they had various forms of coups. The same is true in many European countries. In Germany, in France, in the United Kingdom, the number of citizens who say that a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections is a good thing has roughly doubled over the last 2 decades. In France and the United Kingdom, it's now 50%. Now, it's difficult to know exactly what to make of those kinds of statistics, how exactly to interpret what people say to relatively abstract questions like that, but we see the same transformation in the actual voting behavior of people. Populist parties have risen precipitously in many parts of the supposed heartlands of liberal democracy. In a study I show that in the year 2000, the average vote share of populist parties in Europe was about 8%. Now it's 25%. If you remember Winston Churchill's famous speech that an iron curtain is descending from Stettin in the north to Trieste in the south, that describes the area in which a new populist belt has arisen in the last years. So you can now drive from Stettin in the Baltic, even further south than Churchill was talking about, to Athens and the Aegean, and never leave a country ruled by authoritarian populists. And what you see in these populists is not a common ideology, not a common set of economic views, but a common political vocabulary that sets them against the rule of law and the separation of powers. So we sometimes use this word populist, and it's worth dwelling on it for a moment to explain what it actually means, because we call people like Donald Trump populists, we call people like Recep Erdogan populists, we call people like Viktor Orban populists, we call people like Hugo Chavez populists. At first glance, we don't have a ton in common. As you may have noticed, even if you're visiting this country, our president doesn't appear to be overly fond of Muslims. Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey, doesn't seem to be overly fond of anybody who isn't Muslim. So we don't have that in common. You have some populists who are right-wing economically, who want to reduce or abolish the welfare state and hand out big presents to big businesses and special interests. You have other populists like Hugo Chavez, who are left-wing economically and assail business and want to expand the welfare state. So we don't have that in common. But what we do have in common is a set of ideas about how the political world works. They all say that in the end, the political world is really simple, and the only reason why we have problems is that the political elite is corrupt and self-serving, that they care more about minorities in the country or foreigners than they do about, quote-unquote, people like you and me. And they all say that in order to deal with that problem, you just have to have somebody who gives voice to common sense, somebody who truly represents the people. I am your voice, Donald Trump said at the Republican National Convention. And it's not just that they claim that they embody the voice of the people, it's that they claim that they alone embody the voice of the people, that they are the sole legitimate representative of what the people want. And so by definition, anybody who disagrees with them is not just wrong, it's not just misguided, they're illegitimate. And so once populists get elected, they have trouble delivering on the promises they gave. And they say things like, who knew that things could be so complicated? Who knew that healthcare could be so complicated? I fear that once he negotiates with Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump might say, who knew that talking to North Korea could be so complicated? But of course, they don't want to admit that they've failed to deliver on some of their promises. And so instead, they start to blame. They call the opposition traitors. They say that media outlets are fake news and need to be regulated. They say that independent institutions like the FBI or the Supreme Court are enemies of the people, that they're un-American or un-Turkish or un-Polish. So to understand this phenomenon, which has now developed a playbook of how populists, by claiming to be democratic, by claiming to speak for the people, can slowly dismantle the rule of law, slowly dismantle the separation of powers, and in the end, like in Hungary, constitute an existential threat to democracy. To understand why it is that these forces have been rising in so many parts of the world, we have to try and understand their causes. And here it's important to look beyond any one country. Populism has been rising for the last 20, 25 years. It's not just about 2016. And it's been rising in all of these different countries. So it's not just about one figure, whether it's Donald Trump here or whether it's Recep Erdogan in Turkey. So it seems to me that there are three big driving forces, three ways in which our world today is different from what it was during the long period of democratic stability on which political scientists seized when they said these countries are safe. And coming back to the theme of a conference, I think it's important to see that these factors play into each other rather than being in competition with each other. So the first one is economic. When you look at the United States, the living standard of average citizens has stagnated for a long time. And that's true in many countries in the traditional heartlands of democracy as well. From 1935 to 1960, the living standard of an average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. Since 1985, it's essentially been flat. It's essentially been stagnant. That makes a huge difference in how people think about their politics. It's not that they ever used to love politicians, that they completely trusted them, but they thought they were paragons of moral virtue. They used to say, you know what, I'm doing twice as well as my parents did. My kids are going to do twice as well as me. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt. In the end, they seem to be sticking to their end of a deal. Now I think a lot of people say, you know what, I've worked really hard all my life. I don't have that much to show for it. My kids are probably going to be worse off than me. So let's throw some shit against the wall and see what sticks. How bad could things get? Now, the objection against that, which has been discussed a lot in the last couple of years, is that there isn't a clear pattern to populist support in the income data. In the United States, but this is true of many other countries in the world as well, you can't just look at how much money somebody makes and deduce from that whether or not they voted for the populist candidate. That's right. But there is a very strong geographic pattern to populism. So in the United States, for example, Donald Trump won 2/3 of American counties, but only a little more than 1/3 of America's GDP. He did much better in parts of a country that had less recent economic investment, where there's fewer highly qualified people, even parts of a country in which the share of jobs that might be automated away in the coming decades is much higher. And that holds true wherever you look. Populists are always strongest in the economically stagnant regions of a country. Now, does the importance of this economic variable mean that we don't have to think about culture? No, I don't think so. I don't think so because the world is not monocausal. Most interesting phenomena in the world have more than one cause. If somebody falls in love with you, it's probably for more than one of your attributes. And if somebody leaves you, it's probably because you've done more than one thing wrong. But in this case, the two things actually reinforce each other. It's one thing to say, you know what, I have a pretty good life. I'm doing better than I expected to. oh, look, this guy who's not like me, this guy who's an immigrant, this guy who has a different religion, he's doing well too. Well, you're much more predisposed to say, good for him. But if you are already frustrated, if you already feel that, you know what, I really haven't had a fair shake in my life. I feel like people aren't doing right by me. And what's that guy all about? This guy just came into our country and he's doing better than me? That doesn't seem fair. Right? So there's this nexus between the economy and immigration. And that's especially important because we've underestimated the relevance of the fact that most democracies have been founded with a mono-ethnic, monocultural conception of themselves. So when you go back to Japan, to Sweden, to Germany, to Australia in 1960, and you ask, who really belongs? Who makes a true citizen of your country? The answer would have been very simple, very straightforward. Somebody who's ethnically descended from my group. That was the answer. Now, over the past 50 or 60 years, thankfully, we've started to see that conception change in most democracies. The country where I grew up, Germany, used to make it impossible for somebody to become a citizen unless they were either descended from Germans or happened to marry a German. Those were the two paths. Well, now you can come and get an immigrant visa and work there, and over time, after about 8 years, you can become a citizen. So that's an important change. There's been a cultural change as well. Because these countries have become more diverse, a lot of the population has started to accept that, yes, of course, somebody who's Swedish or German or Italian or Australian can be brown or black, can be Hindu or Muslim or Jewish. But it shouldn't surprise us that there's some strong resistance against that as well. I think we are all people who've done reasonably well in life, who've traveled the world. But think of somebody who isn't perhaps the most affluent person in his country, is not the most educated person, not the person who commands the most social respect. Well, it was always very tempting for a person like that to say, you know, at least I'm Swedish rather than Danish or, God forbid, Turkish, right? At least I'm part of a majority rather than one of those immigrants over there. Well, now that immigrant might be his boss. That immigrant might be representing him in parliament. And that's something that I obviously cherish. But it shouldn't surprise us that people have something to lose there, that this is something that we might be rebelling against. The situation in the United States and in Canada is both similar and different. It's different in the sense that these have always been multi-ethnic societies, but it's similar in the sense that they've always had a clear racial and religious hierarchy, which gave big advantages to one group over others. And we should remember how far we've come in overcoming that. There is no question about the fact that it's better to be a member of just about any minority today in the United States than it was 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. Perhaps not even 2 years ago, but certainly even 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. And so we've made a lot of progress towards equality, but obviously that means that a lot of the people who held those unearned advantages have had to give some of them up and might have to give a few more of them up in the coming years. And it shouldn't surprise us that some of them are not happy about that. Now, if the economic set of reasons explains why people have this underlying distrust of a political system and a lot of the anger that they have, if this often takes the form of this cultural resentment and a sort of rebellion against an equal multi-ethnic society, the third ingredient you need to really make this explosive is the rise of social media. 25 years ago, political elites could still steer the boundaries, the confines of respectable discourse relatively well. There was a set of big TV stations, radio stations, publishing houses, newspapers, and if you wanted to communicate your views to a lot of people, you either had to own one of those or be granted access to it by its owners. Well, over the last 25 years, you've had the rise of the internet, which made it possible for anybody to broadcast their views practically free of charge to the whole world. But it was still difficult to find those websites. That was changed by social media. where today if you take a particularly cute picture of your cat, or for that matter, if you chronicle some kind of government abuse, you only have 100 followers on Twitter. If 10% of them retweeted, 10% of them retweeted, 10% of them retweeted, within a couple of hours, millions of people might have seen that clip. That's a real transformation in our politics, and it can be very good. It means that in many dictatorships, it becomes easier for the opposition to point out corruption and chronicle government abuses. It means that in countries like the United States, it actually empowers some voices that don't have a lot of inbuilt power to really have a say. Think of the brave students in Parkland, Florida, who've been talking about gun control after the horrific mass shooting in their school over the last months. But it also obviously means that hateful voices, that voices that want to spread fake news and wrongful information, have a much easier time influencing public debate. And coming on top of the cultural elements, the economic elements, that helps to explain what's going on. So I just want to end on a couple of words about what to do about all of this. There's a tactical element here. We've seen around the world that once authoritarian populists take power, they skew the playing field. And most of the time, the opposition has about one shot to displace them. In most countries, at the first chance of displacing a populist government, the opposition has been able to do that on relatively fair terms. By the second or third election, they barely had a fair chance. So it's absolutely essential to stop authoritarian populists from coming into power in the first place and to displace them at the first possible opportunity. But there's also a strategic set of things here, because populism has been rising for a long time, driven by these long-term factors. And so in the long run, we're only going to contain it if we actually address those underlying factors. One of those things is about the economy. I'm not going to say much about that today, but a lot of that is in the book, The People versus Democracy. It's to embrace globalization and free trade, but show that you can actually steer its benefits to ordinary people in a serious way. And there's a whole set of economic policies from across the political spectrum that we could adopt in order to do that. But the second and third things I do want to say something about, because I think they speak to the theme of this conference very strongly. And the first is about identity. How do we actually build a sense of collective self-conception on which we actually are able to complete the transition to an equal multi-ethnic society? And I think there's two approaches here that are wrong. The first is one that I was tempted by for a long time. It's to say that nationalism is so dangerous, that it's shaped the 20th century in such deep and horrible ways, that we should leave it behind in the century it's so cruelly shaped. That we should be cosmopolitans, or we shouldn't have a collective identity at all. And I think that's a mistake. First of all, because nationalism can actually sustain important forms of solidarity. But if I, sitting here in Boston, am to care about the victims of a hurricane in Houston, Texas, or for that matter, in Puerto Rico, thinking of these people as my compatriots is an important motivating force. And secondly, because I think nationalism is a very strong force, and if we just ignore it, the worst kinds of people are going to come in and stoke it and bait it until they weaponize it in the worst kind of way. Now, the second response is increasingly common on parts of the left, and that is to say that we should celebrate every form of identity at the subnational level, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, but not embrace the national form of identity. And while without hesitation and without footnote, I think that we obviously need to come to the defense of people who are being attacked and discriminated against on the basis of their identity, I think that that too is a mistake, because we will only build a fair society if we see what unites us across racial and religious and ethnic lines. And so what I argue for is a form of inclusive nationalism or inclusive patriotism, in which we embrace some of the symbols of a nation, we embrace the sense that there is a form of collective identity that's important, but we obviously fight for the fact that it cannot be based on ethnic lineage, it cannot be based on religion, it has to include everybody equally. And I think that's something that Barack Obama in this country has embodied very well. It's something that Emmanuel Macron has movingly talked about in the French electoral campaign, when, for example, in the city of Marseille, he pointed to the audience and said, I see people here from the Ivory Coast and from Mali and from Algeria and from Italy and from Poland, but what do I see? I see the people of Marseille. What do I see? I see the people of France. Look here, ladies and gentlemen of the Front National, this is what it means to be proud to be French. Just one last brief thing, which is about how to deal with social media and the importance of civic values. I don't think the way to deal with social media is to censor social media. It's certainly not to give governments the tool to censor social media, as many countries in Europe are, for example, doing at the moment. I think it is, instead of trying to reduce the supply of noxious idea, to change the demand for them. And one of the ways of doing that is not just to fight for tolerance, but to fight for our political values. From Plato to Aristotle and from Machiavelli to the Founding Fathers, all sets of thinkers who actually thought about how to make a self-governing republic work emphasized the importance of passing our values down from one generation to the next. And while in institutions like Harvard we're very good at pointing out the many injustices and flaws in our societies, and those are real and we need to be upfront about them and address them and fight them, we also need to talk about why our values are important. Why it is that countries that are democratic still do a much better job at living up to the twin promise of individual freedom and collective self-rule than many others. Why, for all of the flaws of our societies, it is better to be a citizen today of the United States, of Japan, of Italy, of Sweden, of Australia, of Argentina, than it is to be a citizen of Venezuela or North Korea or China or Russia. Thanks.